In September, the UN hosted its 80th high-level meeting in New York. The meeting took place against the backdrop of the UN's gravest crisis in decades. It has not been able to make its mark on major international crises, such as in Sudan, in the Middle East, and in Ukraine. The very same month as the high-level meeting in New York, pictures of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un standing side by side during a military parade in Beijing circulated all major news outlets. Against this backdrop, we must ask ourselves, in changing times like these, which institutions for international cooperation are worth saving? And how do we adjust to this new world order that seems to be on the rise? Or said in more philosophical terms, in this burning house, which furniture are worth saving? You are listening to the NUPI podcast, The World Stage. This episode is part of the NUPI-led EU project Navigator. My name is Marie Verhoefden, and I'm your host for this episode. Roland is the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He describes the state of democracy as following.
We're coming out of a period where democracy was in the ascendancy, especially after the Cold War. There was a wave of democratizations in the world in the 1970s and then in the late 1990s. And democracy spread to many parts of the world where it had never been, and it never really took solid root. So it's not too surprising that many of those newly democratized countries are reverting to other forms of government. But at the same time, you've seen the rise of other countries, the resurgence of Russia, the rise of China. They're obviously advancing non-democratic forms of government, and that's contributing to what we've seen, which is a real backsliding of democracy in the world.
We will get back to the backsliding of democracy later in this episode. But first, I want to start by looking into one of the most commonly known arenas for cooperation, being in the United Nations. As a unit consisting of so many different forms of governments, from liberal democracies to dictatorships, it is struggling to actually fulfill its original goal of being a protector of peace.
It's important to remember the United Nations is a lot of different things. At its core, it is a security organization, and it was designed to prevent threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. The idea being that the Security Council will identify these threatening situations and call upon all the members of the United Nations to collectively stand up and prevent those things from happening. Well, the UN has almost never served that role. It was paralyzed during the Cold War between the Soviet bloc and the United States and its allies, and so resolutions in the Security Council were vetoed. There was a brief period of time at the end of the Cold War when the United Nations did function this way, but now it's been overtaken by these disagreements again. The United Nations is not just the Security Council. The Security Council is the really visible part of the United Nations. It's where some of the big issues of peace and security, the wars in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, where the Security Council is supposed to deal with these issues. It's not dealing with those issues because of disagreement among the members. And of course, that is highly visible. A lot less visible is what's underneath the tip of the iceberg, that giant iceberg, which is all the work the United Nations is doing across a vast range of areas. And it continues to perform really important functions.
When reading news about the UN, it's easy to assume that nothing goes in the right direction, with failed UN peacekeeping missions and what some would describe as a paralyzed Security Council. But Roland explains that there are still areas where the UN is getting things done.
The United Nations has never really lived up to its grand aspirations as a collective security organization, but it has contributed on the security side at the margins, if you think about decades and decades of peace operations. And also, the United Nations is made up of lots and lots and lots of sub-agencies. There's 15 specialized agencies. That includes the World Health Organization and the World Bank. And there are all these different smaller programs and funds that are doing really important work in the world. If you think about refugee rights and support for refugees, or Children's Emergency Fund. And then there are even these small organizations, these technical organizations like the International Telecommunications Union. It sets the rules. It has an implication for how the internet will be governed. Those things are really important. It's important not to lose sight of the fact the United Nations is not just the Security Council.
The UN was founded in 1945 and marks its 80th anniversary this year. Ever since the Cold War, the Security Council has been struggling to achieve its goals. The critics are often pointing to the 5 permanent countries with their vetoes as a main reason for this.
I've already alluded to where the UN has failed. It has never lived up to the promise of being this universal collective security organization, partly because the entire system was based on the notion that the great powers of the day, the 5 permanent members, the United States, China, Russia, France, and Great Britain, that they would all be able to agree to take action under situations where there was a threat to the peace, a breach of the peace, or an act of aggression. Well, we saw during the Cold War that there was fundamental disagreements, and we're seeing now that there are fundamental disagreements. Now, some people say the problem is the fact that these countries have vetoes. But the fact is that the United Nations was built with a circuit breaker or a fuse into it, so that if there was fundamental disagreement on something as essential as war and peace, the organization would not blow up as a result of that disagreement. So in a way, the dysfunction of the Security Council is a reflection of that circuit breaker that was meant to avoid destroying the rest of the organization if there was disagreement.
After Donald Trump started on his second presidential term earlier this year, the US has pulled out millions of dollars from the United Nations. This has had huge effects on the UN's work. But a crisis could also perhaps create a window of opportunity to meet the challenges internally in the UN.
Overall, the United States, withdrawing its money from so much of its development assistance, so much of the United Nations system, that's a crisis for the United Nations, and it's a crisis for countries that believe the United Nations continues to perform an important function. It will result in a smaller UN. It will result in some programs being canceled. The world will be worse off and already is worse off now because of these budget cuts. The silver lining, if it can be described as such, is that the United Nations did need reform. It was bloated. It was stuck in ways that it couldn't break out of. And so it's not something that one would wish for, this kind of massive budget cut. It is damaging. But at that moment, this is the moment to be thinking about how to reform the UN.
So, according to Roland, what should we do now?
I prefer to look at the glass half full. There's an opportunity now for Canada and other countries to come together and say, well, where are the gaps, including gaps created by the disappearance of US funding? And what can we do to fill some of those critical gaps? What partners can we work with on different issues? This is the urgency that we face. Yes, the situation is getting more and more serious. Yes, we have to treat this with a great deal of urgency. But the future is still in our hands, collectively and individually. The fact is that the world is undergoing a remarkable period of change right now. And the international system as we know it is changing. And part of the urgency, I think, behind acting now is recognizing that it's going to keep changing. And that if we don't identify individual countries and like-minded partners and others, if we don't identify areas where we really want to make sure that we're working together, sustaining principles and standards that are important. If we don't do that in an assiduous way, then the things that are most important, those things will be at risk too. Some of this structure, some of the international order that we've known is going to fall away. It's going to fragment. That's the world we're heading into. which is why it's so urgent and important to be identifying those issues and those areas that require a really concerted effort from countries like Canada that are distracted by many things. So it has to be focused, it has to be based on national priorities, and it has to be based on coordination and cooperation with partners.
Another institution that has been a cornerstone for cooperation in the West is NATO. The alliance has 76 years of security cooperation under its belt, but recent events, like the war in Ukraine and the rise of illiberal democracies, are putting the alliance to the test. Alexandra Gheciu is professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, director of the Center for International Policy Studies, and she's an expert on NATO. For anyone following Western news, it's easy to assume that the state of international security is now worse than ever since the Second World War. But is that really true? Are we living in extraordinary dangerous times?
I think it's a great question, and I think international security has become so complex and nuanced that it would be difficult and potentially misleading to try to provide a concise and definitive assessment. Our challenge very often is that in the West in particular, our reference point tends to be the early days of the post-Cold War period, when many, both analysts and practitioners, thought that we were embarking on this great new era of peace. Of course, this was not the case everywhere. Suffice it to mention tragedies such as the genocide in Rwanda. But for many in the West, that seemed like a remote reality. And for us, we were stepping into this wonderful postmodern era. Even in that context, of course, there were the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, but even those were, in many instances, dismissed as some kind of temporary aberration that would be transcended and that we would all step forward into this wonderful new world. Fast forward to today, of course, in the context of the war in Ukraine, which is a lot closer to home, it is harder to ignore the realities of international insecurity. At the same time, of course, those of us, or perhaps our parents or grandparents who are old enough to remember the realities of the Cold War, and in particular the early stages when the confrontation was very intense, they were living under the constant threat, or at least perceived threat, of a nuclear disaster. So compared to that, not to mention histories of very intense, very violent conflict in Europe, compared to those realities, we cannot really say that we live in a particularly dangerous or particularly insecure age. Yes, we are at a difficult time, but we can't really say that this is a uniquely tragic or uniquely difficult position. So much of what is happening in terms of international security challenges is less visible because it's happening in cyberspace. They have cyber threats that are becoming increasingly intense and increasingly sophisticated. But of course, we don't see those. Many of us are not even aware that they are an everyday reality and increasingly complicated reality. So this visibility-invisibility dynamics, I think, a unique feature of our day and age.
So what are the biggest challenges NATO is facing in 2025?
NATO is certainly facing a number of very real, significant challenges, but it has certainly evolved a lot, particularly since 2014, following the Russian annexation of Crimea, and even more so after the 2022 full invasion of Ukraine. And it has adopted a number of initiatives that have really helped it adapt to the new international insecurity landscape. There's a lot of emphasis on addressing challenges posed by drones, which is not usually a domain in which NATO was very strong. So it is trying to adapt very quickly. And of course, this builds upon previous initiatives, such as decisions after 2016 to create multinational battle groups in several countries in Central and Eastern Europe, again, to strengthen the eastern flank, to pay more attention to domains such as cyber. So a number of initiatives that have helped the alliance really catch up with the realities of the 21st century to the point where it is now in a much stronger position than it was, let's say, a decade ago. At the same time, of course, we see NATO continuing to enlarge in significant ways, with Sweden and Finland very recent and also very strong additions, and a number of new initiatives to broaden, if you will, global partnerships. So in some ways, NATO is becoming not just stronger, but much more flexible and therefore better adapted to the nuances and the complexities of the current security environment. There is also much more in terms of cooperation between governments and civil society actors as well as the private sector. So here again, we see a blurring of the boundary between public and private, and of course with lots of interesting questions and challenges, but also placing NATO in a much better position to address a number of challenges that are really not confined to the public domain. We see particularly with disinformation campaigns and so on and so forth, where you really see the involvement of societal actors in ways that were not perhaps very prominent in previous decades. So NATO is adapting. It is adapting reasonably quickly, but of course, a number of challenges remain, and to some degree, those challenges are very difficult to transcend because they have to do with domestic politics in key allied states.
NATO was originally built upon a set of shared ideals. The strengthening of democratic values was a central component of NATO's DNA. What happens within NATO when countries like Turkey and Hungary, and lately to some extent also the US, are moving in a more illiberal direction?
You're right to say that NATO was from the very start meant to be not just a military alliance, but a political organization built upon and aimed at strengthening liberal democratic values. And we see this in the Washington Treaty, in the preamble, in Article 2, a number of other articles. So the ambition and the vision was there from the very start. At the same time, we should not be naive in assuming that there was always perfect compliance with those norms and values. Though we see that historically, in countries like Turkey, there were a number of deviations from those values. At the same time, what we see today is unprecedented in terms of the magnitude of not simply deviation from liberal democratic values, but really explicit contestation of those values in a number of key states. And of course, you mentioned that we all know what happens with Hungary, with under Orban, Turkey, and you correctly pointed out, this is also to some degree, and has very alarmingly happening in the United States, where we see the Trump administration challenging a number of core liberal democratic norms. I think this is a real problem for NATO. And again, this explicit contestation in the context of the rise of illiberal political movements on both sides of the Atlantic, I think that places NATO in a position where its credibility as a self-defined institution of liberal democratic communities is being really undermined. Furthermore, what we see is the emergence of really competing views of what NATO's role should be. And we see the very ambitious, let's say, global orientation that is stated in the latest strategic concept in a number of related documents, where we see a very explicit commitment on the part of NATO to not simply defend its member states according to Article 5, but really to participate in a very active way in the protection of the rules-based international order. And that, as a footnote, tends to be defined by reference to liberal democratic values. That vision is still there, and it is at the heart of the official NATO narrative. But now what we see is a very different vision of a much more, if you will, streamlined NATO that focuses on the defense of member states and also on returning to what are seen as the true roots of the Western civilization. Usually that means Christianity, right? So you see statements by people like Viktor Orban saying, for instance, that NATO has no business in Ukraine, because what we see in Ukraine, from his perspective, is really a clash between brotherly nations that are part of the same Slavic civilization. And as Orban explicitly stated, it's not NATO's business to become involved in that. NATO is supposed to protect a very different and to represent a very different civilization, the Western civilization, and it should stay far away from that. So you see, even in this, with respect to this very clear case study, a clashing set of views as to what NATO should do. Not surprisingly, this generates a lot of tensions. Sometimes those tensions are visible and other times they are not. But I think this kind of plurality of contestation of perspectives is likely to complicate life a lot for NATO, particularly when it comes to reaching an agreement on, let's say, what is an acceptable outcome to the Ukraine war. And also, more broadly, what should the future Euro-Atlantic security structure look like? Right? What do we focus on? How ambitious should we be? And I think that's going to be one of the key dilemmas for NATO in the coming years and potentially decades.
No one knows what the future holds, but Alexandra points out the important role NATO is playing, despite internal and external pressures.
Let's engage in this imaginary exercise. Imagine what would happen if NATO went away, if it vanished. And I think it would be extremely difficult to replace it. It would be extremely difficult to find another international institution that would bring together more than 30 states to cooperate as closely as NATO allies are cooperating to achieve interoperability, to address a number of common conventional and non-conventional security challenges. It's very hard to imagine that. Instead, I think we would have a much more fragmented security landscape, potentially with much more insecurity. So with that potential scenario in mind, I think we should try to save those institutions like NATO that have proven to be effective, at least to some degree, and to work on improving them rather than dismantling them and imagining a whole new set of institutions or perhaps more ad hoc arrangements.
Both Roland and Alexandra are pointing out how the rise of illiberal regimes are now reshaping several of our platforms of cooperation, like the UN and NATO. Ole Jakob Sending is a research professor at NUPI, and he leads the Norwegian Center for Geopolitics. He has been following the development in cooperation between authoritarian regimes. How are countries like China positioning themselves?
The growth of number of authoritarian regimes over time, I think combined with the growth and the financial resources of China in particular, has meant that they are taking a stronger position within multilateral settings. And so, for example, China has been pushing this idea of civilizational diversity, which sounds fairly straightforward, but it's code for interpreting human rights in a different way. So acknowledging is their view. Civilizational diversity means that you can't interpret human rights to the letter. You have to look at the civilizational context, if you like. That is one example of how China, but also many other states that do not want to have a strong focus on human rights, seek to change the interpretation of rules and change the outcome of UN resolutions in that direction. And they are, of course, coordinating to push their agenda, just as Western countries have coordinated and pushed their agenda.
So what are the most important alliances between authoritarian states?
So the most prominent one, I think, is the deepening alliance between China and Russia, because they're the most powerful authoritarian regimes. They have for a long time been cooperating through the BRICS, which also includes India, Brazil, South Africa, and that has now recently been expanded to the BRICS Plus. Not all of these are, authoritarian regimes. That should be said. Just to take BRICS first, it's important because that cooperation is aimed at being a counterweight to the G7 and powerful Western countries that do coordinate and do control to a very large degree the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and also in many UN agencies. And so, for example, they try to establish now the New Development Bank, which is, a supplement / alternative to the World Bank that they would control. They try to develop a new joint currency to reduce the dominance of the dollar in the international system. And then you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And there it's very clear that it's Russia and China that are calling the shots. They have many partner countries from East Asia and Central Asia. To me, both the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS are basically counterweights to the G7, which is the Western club, right? And it is not surprising at all that these states that have shared interest try to coordinate and mobilize to advance their interest. And it is in some way also worrisome, of course, because their agenda is very different. They learn from one another for how to stay in power. They develop new tactics for how to weaken international norms that are there and to initiate new governance initiatives that may look the same as the ones that are organized by the UN or the World Bank, for example. But they have a slightly different purpose, which is to strengthen cooperation internally between these authoritarian alliances.
The conversation with Ole Jakob is recorded in Norway, a country right in the middle of the Western world, where we and our like-minded countries are used to being in a position where we can call the shots on the international stage. So if now the power balance in the world might be shifting, what should we look out for?
I think the most important impact is that we have to become much more aware of the fact that we are in a minority. So we have been in a minority for a very long time, but that hasn't been that clear. It is becoming clearer, I think. So one thing that may be at stake here is basically the extent to which these authoritarian states are able to coordinate and cooperate effectively to change international rules that would have huge consequences. So, for example, I don't think that this is going to happen, but to the extent that they are able to mobilize under the leadership of China, for example, just as the West did under the leadership of the US, then they can rewrite the rules, establish new institutions that may not be and probably will not be as favorable to us in Norway or in Europe as those rules that we have grown used to for the last decades. That is for sure. There is a group in the UN called a Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, which consists of China, Russia, Syria, North Korea, Iran, I think. And it's a very interesting example of how they are coordinating within the UN. And of course, it is more than a little bit ironic that, for example, Russia and Syria are part of a group that are advocating for in defense of the UN Charter, right? But this is a little bit, it's an illustration, I think, of how they operate, because they establish these groups, they coordinate and call it something that sounds okay, right? The extent to which they are able to change the rules, that is uncertain, but they are trying to at least change the parameters within which established rules are interpreted. But the big question is really, what is it that other states that are big and important, like Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, etc., where do they fall? The experience so far is that they cooperate with both sides depending on what issue is at stake. So they cooperate with Western states on some issues and are also happy to cooperate with China and Russia on other stuff. So I think the big drama going forward is basically what the majority of the world states, where they will fall down, whether they will support Western-led initiatives or authoritarian-led initiatives.
Some would argue that another notion often assumed in the West is that good rules, values, and principles should guide cooperation with other countries, and that power politics isn't something we would like to associate ourselves with. Have we been a bit naive?
I think we have tended to fool ourselves a little bit by thinking that we're not necessarily engaged in power politics. We're just advancing good values and rules and principles. And why don't all states recognize the importance of that? Of course, you don't need to look very far or long to see that there is massive hypocrisy on the part of many Western powers. The US in particular, with numerous wars, so the war in Iraq is the clearest example, but also lots of other interventions, also during the Cold War, of course. So I think for other states, it's important to recognize that great powers will always try to legitimize their interests by reference to some rules or norms or principles. And they will always be defined in such a way that they will advance their interests. And how that looks, whether you're sitting in, whether you're in Latin America, Africa, Asia, or in Europe, it looks very, very different depending on the situation there. And of course, if you add to this the experience, for example, in Africa, of not only the colonial past, but the continued efforts by colonial or former colonial powers to shape how politics operates in these states and in these regions, is of course something that many leaders will react to. But I think it often will boil down to whether leaders in other countries will see their interests best served by the European Union, the US, or with China, for example. So a big part of the so-called Belt and Road Initiative that China has in all world regions is an effort to basically build infrastructure, and by virtue of building infrastructure, integrate economically, but also, of course, hopefully, from their point of view, politically.
As you might recall in the intro of this episode, I described a photo taken in September this year. The photo is of Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un during a military parade held in Beijing. The parade was held to mark 80 years since Japan's surrender in World War II. What does a show like this and the gathering of these three state leaders symbolize?
That photo symbolizes, I think, at least two things. One is it's part of the rule book or repertoire of certain states to have military parades to signal military and political power. And it's the most physical expression of the power of the state. The other is the attempt, I think, to signal unity and alliance between these states, that they have shared interests. It is an attempt, I think, to send a signal to both domestically, but also to other powers globally, that this is a power to reckon with.
So what then are we left with in the current state of the world? When it feels like the house is burning, what do we save from the flames? Ole Jakob points to the importance of different platforms for cooperation.
So the problem with all forms of international cooperation is that in order to do something, all states have to agree. That's why the UN often doesn't work, right? Now, we haven't talked about the G20, but I do think actually that the G20 is also, big power club. So it has expanded a little bit now with the inclusion of the African Union, which is a very important, I think, addition. But what's important with the G20 are two things. One is that they include both the G7 countries and the BRICS. So you bring both sides, if you like, into the G20. That's important. The G20 can also, I think, be fairly important as a coordination arena for what the agenda will be or should be within, for example, the UN. Because a lot of the negotiations and discussions within the G20, they do subsequently become an indication of priorities to work on within UN agency. And of course, this is not perfect at all because all states should vote on it, etc., etc. But in order to have some progress and momentum, and to have the legitimacy that comes from major powers from different regions being part of the G20, I do think is quite important.
You have listened to an episode of the NUPI podcast's World Stage. This episode is part of the Horizon Europe project called the EU Navigating Multilateral Cooperation, or Navigator for short. If you want to learn more about this topic, you can visit the project webpage at eunav.eu. Your host for this episode was me, Marie Verhovden, and I would like to remind you to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.